welcome. It's good to see people here. Thank you for coming. I'm Linda Grimes. I'm the Executive Director of the San Pedro Waterfront Arts District. I almost said GSPO, which was my former incarnation. Today we're going to have a very special presentation by these ladies at the end. This is the Orchid Quartet with Amy Tatum, no relation to Art, I found out in the elevator, and Austin Wintory. Where'd Austin go? Here he is. And Steve Fox. So today they're going to do their talk, and then afterwards we're going to go to the gift shop and we'll have a short reception over there. Today we have a little special going on. If you make a $10 donation, we will give you an art walk map, because Thursday was the 25th anniversary of the art walk, and we celebrated in fine style thanks to Larson and the Second Line Band. And Leah out front will take that donation as well. So I want to thank you all for being here. If you're not on our email list, check your emails, register, and we'll let you know when we're going to do this again. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Stephen Allen Fox, which I've done many times, but in a bigger theater. Steve is the artistic director and conductor of the Golden State Pops Orchestra, and we've been talking about doing something like this for a long time. The orchestra plays a lot of film music, and I was really interested in, particularly for this space, in doing small ensemble music that plays film music. So that's the ladies over here. Austin has been, Steve will introduce you, but we've known each other since I was with GSPO. So I want to thank everybody for being here and enjoy the show.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So, thank you for coming. And as Linda said, she and I have talked a while when she was talking about this series and her ideas of putting something in here. We talked for a while about what that could be. And you know, although there's a lot of different ideas that got run around, I actually think that in the end, it ended up getting very much into that world of what she was hoping for. And you're going to get a little bit of insight, I guess you could say, and into the mind and the life of what someone like Austin does. We've known each other for some years now, variety of times.
15 years at least, I would think.
Yeah, variety of times performing your music, having you conduct, meeting for breakfast and just talking. And you know, for this one, you've done a lot of video game music, and so it created that nice opportunity to learn more about what you do and how this all works. And I think video game music is something that's probably very different than what people are used to. I mean, a lot of people may not know a lot about how film music's put together, but then it's like video game music, it's even more foreign.
Yeah, many layers get added on top of that.
Right.
Well, I'll just say up front, as part of my own thank you to you all for coming and for inviting me to do this, to Linda, wherever she's heading off to, between you and the GSPO, you know, when we started working together, I'd only lived in LA a few years. And the fact that you were so embracing, and not just of me, but a lot of my friends and colleagues who were also relatively new, you were putting us on stage and letting us perform our music, whether it's video game music, you know, film music, that kind of thing. We did this. One of my favorite memories was the Jerry Goldsmith. Yeah, I got to indulge my obsession with Jerry Goldsmith with a 22 theme medley of his themes and counterpoint with each other. Just because you've always had this attitude of like, hey, we're doing a show, there's a 10-minute slot with your name on it, we'll see you at the rehearsal. No additional discussion. And that's such an indulgence. And not just, I mean, we're going to talk about Journey, but I'll get slightly ahead of us. At one point, GSPO was doing a video game music concert, and you very generously called me up and said, hey, I know you kind of work in games, and do you have anything coming up? And I had been working for 2 years on this game Journey, and had a whole more year to go. And I was like, well, I'm on this game, and it's been announced, and it's not a secret the way a lot of games are secrets until the last second. What do you think of the idea of if I put some like work in progress music on stage as a novelty to the audience to go, here's a game that's not yet done, so here's the music as I understand it today, knowing that a year from now it might all be different. And you guys actually did that. Tina Guo came down and played, and that piece ended up changing the course of the game itself, because the whole team working on the game was based in LA, and we were stuck trying to figure out the ending, and we kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more dramatic and more epic and emotional and all this. And it wasn't working, and we couldn't figure out why, and we just kept thinking, we just haven't solved it quite yet. But meanwhile, because this work in progress piece didn't have to actually follow the game, and because I couldn't really figure out how the game was really supposed to end, I just decided to let it be almost like a concert piece. So I thought, it could be nice. I always like Brahms' third more than the other three. And so I like a piece that kind of tapers to silence is a nice way to end a piece. So I did that with this journey piece, figuring, of course, it's going to be the opposite of that in the real game. And the whole team was in the audience and called me the next day and goes, we just realized that's how the whole game should end. The whole game should go to silence. And it was because of this performance. I did not take it seriously. It was like, no, this is just for fun. This is just a night with GSPO. And like literally here a year later, we were giving talks at developer conferences and things saying, there was this one night down in San Pedro at the Warner Grand Theater where we all suddenly realized how the game should end. And like that game changed the course of our careers so dramatically that to me, you and the orchestra are interwoven with like basically the most life-changing thing that happened in my entire life. So I'm very happy to be here. That's my way of saying thanks for inviting me.
Well, I just want to make a comment that, I appreciate all that, and it's great. I'm proud that we were able to be indirectly, unintentionally a part of that. But like you talking about calling people up and saying, hey, we got a 10-minute slot with your name on it, what would you like to do? That really is part of the philosophy behind how we try to approach everything, because, when symphony orchestras were formed, that's what they were doing.
Right.
Hey, we need music next week, or we need music tomorrow, or, in the case of these composers, and they're throwing these things together, they're doing premieres, and it's brand new music. And now we live in this world that, if you're going to do a symphony concert, you're supposed to play all dead composers, and we've lost what made the symphony orchestra what it was. It wasn't just the quality of that art, it was the art being created now with a living composer pouring themselves into it. And so I'm glad that we've had this synergy that's allowed for this over the years.
It never fails to blow my mind when you read biographies of, the sort of canonized, European composer sort of, the canon of the greats, the Mozarts, the Brahms, the Beethovens, the Bartoks. The number of major works that you read about where it was like, they finished copying the parts about an hour before the rehearsal, where you go, this sounds awfully a lot like Hollywood. It's a funny thing how we have this perception, because there are those exceptions, like Brahms spending almost 20 years on his first symphony and then sort of deciding which orchestra would be worthy of premiering it. But that's so atypical. Everybody else is,
last minute.
Yeah, can we have it Friday? Maybe.
Although David Maslanka, the wind band composer,
right,
he has a mass that he's credited as taking 20 years to compose it. But he's passed away now, but if you asked him, I asked him once, what's it like working on a piece for 20 years and keeping your mind? He's like, I didn't work on it for 20 years. I started it, put it away, and 20 years later pulled it out and finished it.
Yeah, exactly.
But my publisher said, well, we're going to tell him that you worked on it for all 20 years.
It's excellent marketing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. It's like John Corigliano delivering The Ghosts of Versailles 10 years past the due date in the contract with the Metropolitan Opera. I always like that. It was a very bold move, I think, for a composer to just not care about a deadline to that degree. But again, these are the stories, things. These are the things that we don't often talk about.
So what you've seen so far, I hope that you're enjoying it, because this kind of like we're sitting in the living room, it was the words that Austin used when we talked on the phone was, you know what, let's have a conversation like we're in somebody's house and everybody's been invited to kind of enjoy the conversation and see where it goes. So with that, maybe a very quick, brief overview before we actually get into the work of video game music and what it takes and what you've done and the stories you have of your own projects and whatever samples we have to show. What's your short synopsis of what got you to being a video game composer?
Well, I didn't really discover music until I was about 10. I didn't listen to bands or the radio. I didn't go to concerts. It just wasn't my thing. I was into other stuff. I was into film and games and novels, and I was sure I wanted to write, be a novelist or write comics or be a filmmaker. At one point, I was even started studying computer programming, thinking I'm going to make video games. And in hindsight, what I didn't realize is making stuff and or telling stories was the common thread. And only when I finally landed on music, they go, that's the version of this that I think I'm probably the best at, but certainly it's the one I enjoy the most, regardless of any sort of talent with it. It just was the one that spoke to me the most. But the funny thing is that, gaming, when you think back to the sort of event horizon of where your memories disappear, and at some point you're like, that's not a memory I have, that's a thing my parents told me happened. And I don't really actually have a firsthand account of it in my head somewhere. Even at that earliest dividing line, I have memories of playing, Commodore 64, Nintendo, going to the arcade, with a stack of quarters. Like, gaming was always part of my broad, input. And I loved it as a storytelling medium. My favorite games through the 90s were like the LucasArts point-and-click adventures games, like the studio that was responsible for all the Star Wars and Indiana Jones, the Lucasfilm branch off that was called LucasArts. They also made a bunch of original material that had nothing to do with Star Wars and Lucas and other kind of George Lucas sort of ecosystem. And there were these games, Monkey Island and the Full Throttle and The Dig, and these were games where they were very different than other games because they were basically a storyline that you get by solving puzzles. You couldn't die, you couldn't fail. You just, if you couldn't figure it out, you just sat there with it. Like Myst. Myst was not one of their games, but that's a game that a lot of people played in that era that's sort of similar. And they were smart stories. I remember the crowning jewel was this game that came out in 1997 called Grim Fandango. That was like this mashup of Mexican Day of the Dead sort of mythology with this 1940s film noir kind of smoke-filled cocktail thriller. And the score by Peter McConnell was absolutely incredible. It was one of the first, because this was not long after the advent of the CD-ROM, it was also one of the first game scores to feature live musicians. And they are up in the Bay Area, so he went around and got all these, he got street musicians, like buskers, and he got these absolutely killer jazz musicians. I remember there's a bunch of bass clarinet featured on that score, which was played by a guy in Tom Waits' band. So it's like personality-filled bass clarinet. So for, whatever I would have been 13, 14 years old, it was really making a huge impression. And I remember there's a line in that game. The game it's sort of a comedy, but it's like film noir, intriguing comedy. So your character is basically the Grim Reaper, which they refer to as a travel agent to the land of the dead. And his job is to greet souls as they're crossing the line. And there's this character where it's sort of what tips off the whole story, where this girl looks at you and she says, "You're not the nurse." And he goes, "No, but I am here to ease your pain." He's trying to be smooth. And she has this moment, and then she goes, "I guess they couldn't save me." And that's the introduction to this character. It starts this realization that she's waking up in the land of the dead. And I just remember going, oh my God, this happened because I clicked on a thing, and then this happened as a result. And it just was one of those lightning bolt moments of realizing this is a very compelling way to tell a story. This is different than watching a movie, or different than reading a book, or other things, poetry, etc. So I was really passionate about this art form, while on this parallel track, obsessed with music, obsessed with Jerry Goldsmith. In those days, video game music was written by staff in-house composers. And because I was so passionate about, I was learning conducting, and I was learning about the concert repertoire, and of course film music, and Goldsmith and Williams and all the kind of giants of that field. I didn't think of those things as being on a collision course, because it was like, no, if you want to write video game music, you have to go get a 9-to-5 job at a video game company. Because in those days, that was the only people writing video game music. They were and they had to also do sound design, and they were the audio department. Mm-hmm. And the industry was still sort of young enough that true specialists were rare. And I mean, typically the joke was always, especially in the late 80s in the game industry, it was, you know, a group of 10 people getting around to make a game out of like a garage, you know, in Santa Barbara or wherever, and someone says, is anybody here playing the instrument? And one person in the back is like, I mean, I kind of did. And they're like, hey, you're the composer. That's how most games were scored for the first 20 years of gaming. And so I never took it seriously as a career path because I was looking at Jerry Goldsmith, you know, conducting at Todd A.O. and thinking that's just a whole other world, you know. And so, but by dumb luck, right around the time I was in university here at USC, having moved here from Colorado where I was growing up, that was changing rapidly, and the idea of a freelance composer was becoming a thing. It's very much parallel to the old Hollywood studio system where everything was done on contract within one company, and as they, you know, got bigger and more elaborate, things started to decentralize, and you would, you know, instead of a director who always works for Fox and the composer who always works for Fox using the Fox, you know, staff orchestra and all that stuff, it was like, no, everything can be done in a more freelance kind of pickup way, up to the directors, the cast, everybody. And games, while they're still very corporate in the way at least the bigger games are made, composers and other like art department folks started to become increasingly freelance. And that happened by dumb luck right as I sort of moved here. And I just happened to meet people who were making interesting games while I was a student, and it kind of put me on the path.
So what do you think is what's the thing that made that shift where it went from the in-house to the freelance and suddenly there's these elaborate musical scores being written and eventually recording with live musicians? I mean, what made the companies decide, is it the composers themselves wanting to expand more and be more expressive, or was it the games and the way they were storytelling them?
I think it's a lot of factors kind of happening simultaneously. First off, games started to reach a budget level and an elaborate, like before what was all done, basically all games were made by engineers. You know, you had what we call programmer art because it wasn't an artist. Like now, you can have an actual painter who is making paintings and then, you know, collaborating with the team, and you're sort of bringing them to life in the way that if you ever watch like behind the scenes on how a Pixar film is made or something, there's a lot of overlap in these processes where it's an artist, someone who probably went to art school or has spent their whole life in front of canvases or tablets or whatever, honing this craft and now applying it to film. At the end of the day, if you couldn't write code, you were useless for the first many decades of the game industry. But once the tools reached a point where now you didn't have to, like the early composers had to, the music was being generated, that's why we call it chiptunes now. The music was not being played back. You fed the computer, the software, the system, the computer, whether that's a Nintendo or a PC or whatever, you fed it instructions and the hardware literally generated the sound in real time. On the one hand, that lets you do some really cool interactive things because there's no pre-baked audio. So you can, if you want the music to slow down, speed up, to loop, to mute that instrument, you know, they were doing things that are now a lot more difficult. You know, Koji Kondo talking about, oh yeah, well, you know, if you're running around in Super Mario World and you jump on Yoshi, I added in drums, like on the next eighth note. And, you know, that was trivially easy to them because all of it's being generated in real time from nothing because it's all synth, it's all electronic. And very, very basic electronics. We were talking typically 3 voices, a lead, a bass, and a noise generator, which is just creating like pulses of white noise that becomes your percussion. So, you know, all these composers are big nerds for Bach and you know, Bartók and Brahms, all the like hardcore contrapuntalist composers, because they literally had 2 monophonic voices at a time for the first 10 years of video game, and it had to be done through code. So just a completely different era. Once the tools reached a point where they said, oh, we can just have an MP3 that plays back. Suddenly it was, okay, now we can kind of write so-called real music, and I say that definitely in quotes because I'm a believer in the kind of brilliance of what the early generation of game composers did. But nonetheless, it's a whole different thing if you can suddenly record audio. And because now recorded audio all weighs the same, as it were. It doesn't matter if it's you cooking it up in the computer and just rendering it, or if it's the London Symphony recorded at Abbey Road. There's no difference from a software standpoint between those anymore. So then suddenly that combined with the fact that budgets were just gradually rising, and they realized, what if we like hired people that do this full time? Because there's the other aspect of a composer that's on retainer all year long, essentially. There's only so much that they can do, which means that they then have to have other jobs. And they thought, well, we could probably get a better composer if all they do is music. They only have to worry about music, and then they're not an employee, they're an independent contractor to the company. And then they started to recognize independently of that, there's actually good financial benefits to not having them an employee as well. Like, we just hire them as a one-off contractor. That's probably better for everybody. Then composers can work on multiple games at once, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, then the tipping point invariably happened where 1997, Steven Spielberg realizes, I should be working in games. That's an interesting space. What are we doing there? And the way the story's always gone, I've never pinned him down to ask this question. I always mean to, and then I forget when the moment happens. But a young, unknown guy who was working in QA in the video game, meaning quality assurance, named Michael Giacchino, finds himself in the room on this Spielberg adaptation of his Jurassic Park sequel called The Lost World. And the story as it is told, that I have not yet verified, was that he had been basically told, okay, you're gonna score the game. This is well before anything, before he did TV, before he did any of the Pixar stuff. And he said, well, where are we going to record the orchestra? Because it's a Jurassic Park thing, and Steven Spielberg's in the room. And they went, no, there's no budget. Games don't record with live orchestra. And Spielberg, being Spielberg, was like, if it's a game of mine, it is. So he became the first composer to ever use a Hollywood orchestra on a video game. That started a bit of a thing. And then, before you know it, you have, like one of the great kind of auteur, innovative game designers, a guy named Hideo Kojima, who had worked on this franchise called Metal Gear, and he was obsessed, is obsessed with that kind of Hollywood blockbuster aesthetic. So it was sort of frothing at the mouth at the prospect of a Hans Zimmer type scoring one of his games. So when his second, he made Metal Gear, and then Solid Snake, and then Metal Gear Solid in the late 90s, which is a very Michael Bay kind of game. Very smart. I mean, he's a pretty brilliant designer, very, very innovative and creative. But you can also feel this very blockbuster kind of obsession in his work. By the time it came to do the second Metal Gear Solid game, their budget had reached a point where they actually essentially approached Hans, and he said, have Harry do it. So Harry Gregson Williams ended up scoring, I think, 3 or 4 of those in a row. And that was one of those moments where it was he was quite established by that point, because now we're talking early 2000s. So then you have a major Hollywood composer working on a video game, and that started, again, there's just these ripples just kept happening. And it still happens. I mean, recent example is the first project that she signed after winning the Oscar for Joker, Hildur Gudnadottir, did EA's Battlefield 1942 or Battlefield 2042. It's literally hey, you just won an Oscar, and the presumption would be, the conventional wisdom is, here's one of 1,000 movie opportunities that are available to you now. And the first thing that she and her husband Sam did was jump onto a video game. So it's changed a lot, in other words, from the days of Koji Kondo or Al Lowe or the other kind of early chiptune composers. And so all that shift in the world was happening kind of right as I joined the industry by dumb luck. So, 5 years earlier, and it would have been, you have to go get a job at one of these companies. 5 years later, and it would have been, there's now 20 million more people doing this. And I just happened to get in at this moment where, when I would go to a game developers conference or whatnot, there'd be maybe dozens or even hundreds of other composers, but it's probably 50 times that or 100 times that now. Mm-hmm. Because it's just, the whole world goes, this is so awesome, I want to do it too. And I don't blame them. And in fact, I always try to encourage people, it's a big industry. There's opportunities for essentially everybody. And we're all the better for a wider and deeper talent pool of composers. I love that the tent has grown and grown and grown.
Now, with this, obviously, in that story you told, there's a lot of connection and overlap between film music, video game music, the composers trading over, how somebody like Steven Spielberg had a big impact on the direction of where video game music was going to go. So, being that it's all media music and there's a storytelling element to it, for a film, you have a narrative in front of you of a video that you have to write to. It's timed out for you, where the emotional hit points are. It's all shown to you. and you're having to follow that narrative to the millisecond. How does a video game differ from that?
Yeah, it's the classic question, and they are wildly different. You know, it's one of those that there's a lot of. When I first got started, there were a lot of my colleagues. This is less true now, but it felt like every composer scoring games or trying to find their footing in the business were basically people that would really probably prefer to be doing movies, but came to this conclusion that somehow easier in games to get the ball rolling. So there was a lot of kind of like, this is a lot of stuff I don't want to think about. Can't I just kind of score this like a movie? Can't you just basically, like with a classic approach, is you sit down and you play through the game and you have your computer capturing what's on screen the whole time. And then you just go and now you have a video file of someone playing and you go, okay, I'm going to score that. And it's basically now I'm scoring a movie. I thoroughly reject that. I think that's horrible. I was one of the few among that. Now I'm surrounded by people who are very similar to me, but in those early days I was much more of a loner, of a guy that was really passionate about the games themselves and game design. Like I said, this was a possible career path for me at one point, was making the games, where you're studying programming and you're studying the architecture of how software engineering works. And I find it hard to imagine scoring games without some awareness of all of that. So like an obvious example, so we're gonna, spoiler, as if spoilers right now are a thing. But later, when the fabulous musicians come up here to play, most of the music they'll play is from one of the Assassin's Creed games that I wrote music for. And that's a perfect example where Journey is a pretty linear game. You basically start in location A, it leads to B, it leads to C. Now there's a variation within these it's kind of like, imagine going from room to room to room. Like we start off in this room. There's different things we can do in this room, but we're in a fundamentally finite space. And then we go out here into this kind of courtyard area, but it's also kind of a relatively confined space. And then there's a room beyond that. Journey as a game is designed more or less like that. It's a succession of spaces. Even if it's outdoor and it's the desert and it feels like you could walk infinitely in all directions, you actually can't. The game will at some point be like, we're gonna go ahead and nudge you back onto the path. So you are in what is essentially a room, whether it looks like it or not. It's like being on the holodeck in Star Trek. It might look like an infinite horizon, but there's a definite wall there. And so Assassin's Creed, on the other hand, is an actual legitimate open world game where the one that I worked on is called a Syndicate, which takes place in Victorian era London, 1860s London. And they basically recreated London to scale. So it's like, oh, I'm standing next to Westminster Abbey. I can walk for 30 minutes and cross the Thames and go, check this thing over here. And the world is populated by all these things that might pull the music one direction or another. So, for example, we created a system where there's these landmarks dotted throughout the city. And if you're looking in the game at the map of the city, you'll see these locations. And they tell you where it's like, here's an area of the city that you haven't sort of discovered yet. You haven't mapped this area. So when you go there, one of the whole hallmarks for those unfamiliar with these games, and we'll show a clip and you'll get a taste of it, but there's a whole kind of like parkour, free climbing as if it's just nothing. Just like, oh, I'm just going to scale the face of Big Ben. It's no big deal. That's sort of one of the things, that's part of the fantasy of these games, is they all take place in historic locations at historic times where you can kind of interact with these environments. And very famously, for example, the Assassin's Creed before the one I worked on is called Unity, that takes place in Baroque era Paris. And the story was, I've been told this is not quite true, but it made for an excellent untrue headline. No shortage of those, I guess. They did such a realistic 3D model of the Notre Dame for that game that when it was on fire, they actually were able to send it to the fire department to basically know where they were going with such accuracy that they could essentially plan how to fight this fire in a way that it was sort of superior to any form of blueprint or anything, because they made a 3D explorable model of it that was so extremely accurate for the purposes of that game that it was like it served a pragmatic use in real time when there was an emergency. I've been told that that's not entirely true, that like the person who kind of put that online and claimed credit for that was perhaps overreaching, but I think it's a cool story, so I'm going to choose to live in the reality where that's a true story. In the case of Syndicate, they really did. It's really accurate to London. And so, if you climb up onto one of these landmarks to kind of reveal the area of the map, there's a whole system that has to happen where, first off, the computer is aware of the altitude that you're at. So if you're halfway up the face of Big Ben, the system knows, and then the moment you cross more than halfway, it knows, okay, you're towards the top. So we do a thing where, okay, I'll start to warm up the music to go, there's probably a pretty giant, majestic, amazing landscape about to arrive, since I'm going to be on top of Big Ben looking over this incredible, early Industrial Revolution era of one of the most seminal cities on planet Earth. And they do such a good job. Again, you'll see in the clip, they do such an incredible job at rendering this visually. So we do a thing where the music starts to kind of wind up into something. Then once you get halfway there, we are kind of rolling the die that we're pretty sure, because you're halfway up the face of this thing, and you can't really get there by accident, you have to climb up from the street. That means you're probably intending to climb to the top. So once you reach about halfway, the system will kind of shift into a new piece of music that's a little bit more elaborate, a little bit more involved. We also did this whole thing, this whole system of, there's buskers all throughout the city playing folk songs, and they had this whole elaborate musicological research project of what would people have been hearing on the streets in 1863 London. So we recorded like an hour and a half worth of street musicians, brass, like a brass quartet in a gazebo in Hyde Park, and all these kinds of things, just musicians, drunk violinists, everything you can imagine. And all based on hymn tunes and folk songs and things that would have been accurate to the time. We then said, okay, let's assign one, like they'll all be sprinkled throughout, but let's say that, a famous song, like there's one called The Ratcatcher's Daughter. Let's say that that's the one that we want to kind of give a little extra attention to, proximate to Big Ben. So then the way it works is you might hear someone doing it, and then as you're climbing up, the score, because it's aware of not only how high you are, but where you are in the city, I actually did my own arrangement of that tune so that as it comes in, it's kind of like this, the real world diegetic musicians are handing off to the score, the non-diegetic score, that I then pick up, and it makes its way until you get to the very, very top, and then you're standing and the character's kind of perched like a bird on top of like the absolute pinnacle. And there is always this thing they call the leap of faith. It's kind of one of the hallmarks of the game where the character does this massive swan dive off the top and always lands in a very conveniently located bale of hay, which I wouldn't have thought to be the most shock-absorbing substance in the world to survive like a 40-foot free fall, but it works. And it's one of those where on top of all of that, in addition to the fact that the music is sculpting every step of the way up there, and then you reach the top and it loops, you hit this little button to kind of reveal the map that you hadn't seen up to that point, which plays this, it does this big panoramic 360-degree view of the city around where you are. We get a little piece of music associated with that. And then when the character does this leap of faith, I give like a little quick version of that Ratcatcher's Daughter or whatever one more time as they jump. And as if it all weren't enough, the player can be playing one of two characters. And so it's their twin siblings, Jacob and Evie. And if you're playing as Jacob, you hear violin solos played by Sandy Cameron. And if you're playing as Evie, you're hearing cello solos played by Tina Guo, so that every step of the way, whatever instrument is the lead is dependent on whichever character you chose. So on top of writing this musical piece that is actually more like a bunch of pieces that are all kind of fastened together, I have to account for the fact that I don't know which character the player is going to be playing as, so everything has to be able to go each way. So then this extrapolates across all these different systems where if the player does all of this and then they get straight and they get in like a tussle with a copper on the street, the music has to then pivot into kind of combat music, and it didn't know in advance what was going to come first or second or whatever. So all these different systems have to kind of exist independently of each other, knowing that you don't really know what the player is going to do. It's fundamentally non-linear. It's the starkest contrast to the film notion of, the movie will always start and end. Once they've locked the picture, it will always be this amount of time. It can't be more. It can't do things unexpectedly. But the games, they just get more and more and more and more complicated of how are all the different ways that the music might sort of connect to other pieces of music. You end up with these juxtapositions where you don't know what's going to happen. You have no idea what is going to lead into what. And so I'm always looking for ways to say, how do I tell a 3-act story structure superimposed on a thing like that, which is, again, I could go on and on and on. Assassin's Creed was an enormous man. Did I fail?
Oh, the microphone fell down there.
Oh, I thought you had a question. I was very excited.
So
know
let
how
me
that
ask,
fell off.
I have a question. So when you're talking about that, and maybe we can show, like you said, the clip of that here in a second, but when you're talking about a scene like that in a video game, when you talk with the creators, are they talking about all of that with you and how that happens, or is that something as a composer that you are figuring out that I need this music to do this here, and I need this to do this here, and then I want it to do that there? Is it led from their concept, or is in a situation like that you're the one that's like halfway up? I need this to happen musically, and now I've got basically 3 different pieces of music that I'm writing, but they meld together into one.
It's a bit of both. It really depends on the game. In the case of something like Assassin's Creed, this was the 6th game in the franchise, so they had a kind of a general playbook where they go, here's sort of what's worked for us for the because first Assassin's Creed came out in 2007, I think, and I was scoring this in 2015. So we were almost a decade in, and they had shipped a bunch of it. Now Ubisoft is an unbelievably gigantic studio, and these games are just hard to fathom how giant. Like Journey was made by 12 people, Assassin's Creed was made by about 1,050. So like they're really different scales. And all over the world too. It was like, oh yeah, the studio in Berlin made this one. The studio in Singapore made like this level of the game. Where you realize, oh, there's 250 people that no one here has ever actually met that focus solely on this corner of the game. Like the composer is one of those unique positions. I'm one of the few ones to actually kind of canvas across every area of the game. Everyone else tends to be a bit siloed who work on it, other than like the most senior level director type positions. So point being, they were like the game. I had less than a year to score it, so it was more done than not done. So a lot of this stuff was, okay, we need music for all these different things that will be happening in the game. So there's a certain amount of prescription of just, here are things. But that said, I was a fan of the franchise. I was also perhaps slightly bullheaded, because I walked into the first meeting and I said, okay, so I've played the last 5 ACs. I have notes. Are you open to my notes? And they were like, to their credit, they were like, please, yes. Because I said, I want to completely overhaul the combat system. I want to completely overhaul this and that. And they basically embraced all of it. Because one of the things, for example, that's one of my biggest pet peeves, is when you're designing systems, especially if they take months to conceptualize and actually execute and get all the bugs out of the software and actually have it functioning correctly, by the time you're ready with a thing that works, you're so emotionally invested in it that even if it sucks, you just think, this is it, this is what it's going to be, because I worked on it, therefore it must be awesome. Like, those things naturally follow somehow. And so I was coming in and going, here's the thing. One of my biggest pet peeves is when you're playing a game, you develop these elaborate systems. Okay, it's going to be really cool. We're going to have, you get into a big fight in the street, and you're fighting all these bad guys. And the music has like an initial intro where it kind of spools up. Like say there's no music playing of any kind, you're just coming in from a completely quiet situation. Then I get into a tussle. So the music, and a common way to do it is you have like a little maybe 4 to 8 bar, just a little introductory phrase that plays as what we call a one shot or a stinger. So it's a piece that just plays. Then on whatever bar, say the downbeat of bar 9, is the first bar of a loop that will go in a circle for as long as that fight lasts. Now, you can then start to do other tricks. For example, that loop can scale vertically. So let's say that it's a fight that I'm fighting with just one person, and then 10 other, like there's like a whole battalion of police walking by. They go, we gotta stop this fight. They intervene. Somehow it becomes a fight of 1 versus 1 to 1 versus 11. So we can do things like, what if that same loop has the ability to add a bunch more instruments into the mix so that you feel the stakes suddenly raise, and it goes from, oh, it's just a single violin kind of woodshedding on material to, oh, there's a whole orchestra suddenly there. So that would be what we call sort of a vertical development. Now, the problem with that is vertical writing demands a kind of lowest common denominator, because it means all the layers sort of stacking on each other have to work in succession. Well, music doesn't actually typically work like that. And if I have a violin solo on this stage playing all by themselves, and then we add 50 musicians behind them, they're not going to play the exact same way. Even acoustically, it's not even possible. But also emotionally, it's very different. So I'm always looking for ways to kind of cheat it, where it feels like you're adding things, but it's sort of becoming a new performance. So the music can branch, and we developed this whole system where I said, okay, well, let's take stock every so often and go,
by the math, by the under the hood kind of statistics of what's going on, am I winning or am I losing? Let's start to tilt the music different directions emotionally based on that information. Like, in other words, is it getting harder to stay alive or not? But more fundamentally, before we get into any of that, the biggest pet peeve that I've long had with games like this is if it's a really easy, like Assassin's Creed, these little like quick instantaneous assassinations is like one of your moves in the game. And so that's not combat, but the system thinks it's combat. So I said the thing that drove me crazy was you'd come up, you do your little move, bad guy goes down, and the system is, the body has hit the floor and the moment is over before the third bar of the intro has even finished. Never mind all the looping. So it's like you've activated a machine that takes a minute to turn off for the sake of a moment that lasted 1 second. So I said, we can't do that. I said, so my proposal was, let's develop an algorithm that basically is drawing a giant circle around the player that says, within, say, 100 feet, if everyone who might fight me were to, how serious of a situation would that be? And that's not an easy question to answer because you're making your character stronger over the course of the game. You're developing you get like new armor for your character and things that make you more resistant to injury and damage and all that. So it's basically measuring, okay, what's my general threat and safety level relative to the damage potential of everyone around me? And then we make a call on, if this is an insufficiently threatening situation, no music plays. So it's only if you're in a situation that, yes, I'm clearly going to be in this fight for a few minutes, will we even trigger music at all. That was one of those pitches I made to them where I said, can we get rid of the knee-jerk introduction anytime the character does anything to a musical system that is then not actually playing in service of anything? And they were like, sure, yeah, great. If you don't mind the extra work of developing and proofing the system and making it work and then obviously writing, it's like one of those, you spend all this time and you get the thing working, you're like, oh, this is great. They go, okay, cool. Now, by the way, we need like 2 hours more of this music by September and it's May. That part is always a little bit of a reality check, but and that's part of the reason why sometimes these systems kind of hold longer as the franchise gets, because it's just so much work to change them. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff where I love getting into those systems. I love getting in there and going, what is the player's actual experience? What's the story that we're trying to tell? Another one that's a classic example of a thing I can't stand that they do in games is the tail end of this moment. Say I fight off all the bad guys and I win, the music goes, oh, you won. And it's like the instant you perform the last, death of a bad guy, your last kill, the music goes, ha, it's over. And I go, that's not what the character would be experiencing. Their heart would be racing for like an hour after this is over. Now, it's a game. We can take some liberties. But I said, there should be a kind of a downshifting. When you're driving down the highway and you realize, oh, this is my exit, you don't just suddenly find yourself in the parking spot of where you were going. Like, there's a process of deceleration, and that's part of the rhythm of life. And that's where I was going, it's all well and good to design a system that seems really cool, but we have to make sure it kind of maps to the lived reality of what the player is going through. And every game is a little different. Some games are really fast-paced, some are really slow-paced, and how you kind of work out that timing and how synchronous things need to be is a really interesting challenge. And bear in mind, everything that we've talked about so far, nothing has anything to do with, by the way, what's like the right melody?
Right.
How do we actually write the correct music separate from all of this? This is why I love working in this field. It's exhausting and terrible. No, it's awesome. I love it. It's really demanding, but that's what I love about it.
I think in everything you just described, I know for me, and I'm guessing for a lot of other people, no one would ever know the amount of thought and programming and process that after a game's already been created, you're coming in and what you're wanting to do with the music so that it's helping support a story and a character is ultimately, even if it's not that exact game, maybe it's a future one, if there's a lot of program shifting that has to happen, it's impacting how games are made. And it's impacting the programming behind it so that, as you're describing, it's almost like somebody took film music, you're watching a narrative and you feel what's happening. How can we now make that not just interactive in the sense of I'm playing a game, but in a sense that as the player, I'm truly now falling into the mindset of this character, because someone like you is going to the extent of one little shift, because like you're saying, it's like, okay, that final event just happened, but how quickly do we shift to the next thing? Let's think realistically about it.
And musically.
And musically, and so narrative of music and what it can do to emotionally support something is starting to impact the gameplay to the point where it makes it feel even more interactive. It's taking it to that next level where I'm not just saying the emotion, I'm actually going to dictate what you as a player might choose in your next few minutes.
Yeah.
Because it didn't just, like you said, if it just ended, oh, you succeeded, the player is now jumped to the next thing uncomfortably. But by easing out of it, you're actually altering how the course of that game is going to go, which in the case of a game like that, it becomes highly, highly successful. Now, I do want to say with that game, one other thing before we show them the example, something unique with that game that hadn't been done a lot before was the chamber aspect of what you were going for. If you don't know that score, it's not necessarily this large orchestra.
No, not at all.
Like we've talked about, which is part of the reason why it fits well for what we're doing today.
Yeah.
But,
that was definitely part of my pitch. You know, the AC franchise had been worked on by a wide variety of composers. Jesper Kiss, the composer who did the first few games, and then Lorne Balfe did the third one, Brian Tyler did the fourth one, and then the Chris Tilton and Sarah Schachner kind of tag teamed through the one right before mine. The one thing that most of them had in common is they tended to be very electronic. The scores are deliberately a bit anachronistic to the historic locations as a kind of aesthetic choice, but with usually some kind of wink and a nod to it some way or another. Like Sarah, for example, she's a great string player, so the Baroque France one that she did the music for, you know, she recorded kind of quasi-Baroque string parts nested within a bunch of synths and very kind of grungy analog electronics. But the thing was with Syndicate, when they approached me, they said, part of the reason we're approaching you, because I wasn't known for this kind of game at this time, they said, we want to kind of like sidestep everything we've been doing for the last 10 years, because they felt like this franchise, every year, every time a new one comes out, people are kind of like a little bit less excited, it's sort of like, yeah, okay, it's still pretty cool, and it's still very industry standard in a certain way, but that spark that really defined the first couple, they felt like they were also that Baroque one was a huge disaster of a release. It was like the game didn't work right and it turned all the fans again. So there was a certain amount of like, we got to redeem ourselves with this game as well. So we want to try to offer up something really fresh and really different. So I've heard that before when someone says, hey, would you be willing to talk to us about the game? And I take them at their word and I kind of say, here's what I would do. And then I never hear from them again because they say they want different, but what they really mean is it's going to be basically 90% of what we're familiar with, and then maybe there's like, instead of violin, it's Hardanger fiddle. And you're like, that's still fundamentally a violin, but yeah, okay. So on this one, I took them at their word, fully expecting to never hear from them again, and to my amazement, they said, great, we love it, when can you start? And which was, let's kind of go the opposite route. Let's essentially have effectively no electronics. And I said, you know, the thing is with these assassins, they're like Legolas. They're light on their feet. They don't seem to obey the laws of physics. They're bouncy and nimble. And I said, a big lumbering orchestral sound kind of runs counter to that in my mind. I want something where I can record. In this case, it was principally a group of 9 musicians that we recorded in London, a nonette of 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, as 9-part writing. Like, it wasn't 3-part writing of mini sections. It was, no, think more like the Mendelssohn octet plus 1. In terms of its conception, it's 9 parts where I can get really thick in the internal division of labor, or I can unify them if it makes sense in a given moment. And we record them inches away, you know, so that it feels like it's just right in your ear. It's almost like the music's in your skull. You're not listening to a thing, whereas orchestras become an interesting production balance of how do I simultaneously capture the intimacy of the individual colors throughout the orchestra, but also the kind of wider view. And the kind of classical way of recording an orchestra is essentially the audience POV, where you're hearing the orchestra as a homogeneous unit. The more Hollywood way of approaching it, which I think is I like that sound better because you can kind of have the cake and eat it too. It's to simultaneously have your ear in multiple places. Your ear is there and it's here. But I said, we shouldn't do the remove view for this. Let's only be in here. And I said, so, it's just a few musicians for the majority of it, where you have our kind of core group of 9. But even then, I said, let's make that a consequence of the storyline of the game. So the whole first third of the game is principally just 1 violin and 1 cello. So it's really, really, really sparse. So then by the end of the game, we indulgently add 2 trumpets to playing 2 separate parts from each other. And so it's still a chamber ensemble, but we've migrated to 11 musicians.
Added color.
Yeah, but when that happens, when you play a game, this game takes like 50, 60 hours to play. When you're at hour 45 and suddenly trumpets appear, it's like, if I sat there and completely still and didn't move, and then after an hour and a half I went, it feels like a seismic event. And so let's try to go that route. Not that the music is minimalist at all, quite the opposite. The music is some of the thickest and most daunting, as you'll see with our poor suffering musicians. These were hands down the most difficult recording sessions I've ever had before. Was so much so that I remember there was I had to write one source cue. There's a scene in the game where the characters have to dance this kind of minuet together. And so I wrote like a little violin, viola, cello trio. And so it was the very last cue we recorded at the end of a week of sessions. And so because everybody else was done, we dismissed the orchestra and kept behind just the 3, like the first violin, first viola, first cello, and said, can we just read down, we just need a couple takes, a very simple, very intentionally kind of, Schubert-esque piece. It was meant to feel like it's in-world, it's believably 1860s music. They mo-capped musicians. They even told me, the only restriction we're going to give you is it has to be at this tempo because we mo-capped musicians playing at that, like to a click with no music because the music wasn't written, but to that tempo. So I had to write a piece that you would see in the world being played. So I wrote this piece, and then I remember they finished, it was great, it was super quick and easy, and then on the headphones, my recording engineer, Jake, said, something quite unusual has just happened. You're needed in the commissary, like the little cafeteria area of the studio. And what's going on there? And he goes, oh, you'll see. I walk in. The orchestra had stayed and brought in champagne and cake because they were like, we survived this horrible week of unbelievably difficult music, and we are celebrating, damn it. And it was crazy because I'm used to, I don't begrudge, especially in a world of freelance session musicians, I don't begrudge people, often there's another gig later that night or a show or something. But everyone decided to stick around, and not just stick around, but wait until the colleagues had finished. And it was very touching. It also made me realize, probably wrote the music too hard. If they're celebrating me leaving. Yeah.
Goodbye.
Let me play the little teaser I have of it. Let me see if I can.
And maybe after that video, play a few minutes of the one that shows you creating the motific idea.
Yeah, I can do that. I'm so zoomed in. Oh, here we go. I'm trying to get to my full screen control. Oh my Lord. What if I just double click it? There we go. We did the piano at 9 after everyone left. Feels. that was a little taste of that one. And then just about ready to shift over to our musicians here, but I can show the video he was talking about here. I'll just show a little, just a little bit of this. I'll show a little bit at the beginning, and then I'll skip to the end. How about? Since I realized at one point that generally, when I would talk to folks, especially in a context like this, with people who may not ever talk to somebody who worked on video game music before, I realized so much work can go into creating even just 1 minute of music that I was working on this video game called The Pathless a couple years ago, and I thought it could be fun to document every step of the way of creating literally 1 minute of music from this game. The score ended up being over 3 hours of total music, but there was one particular 1 minute section where I just, every time I worked on it, I would turn on a camera and film the steps from the blank page staring at me all the way through to it's playable in the game. And I created a little YouTube video, and you can find it on YouTube. It's just called How I Wrote 1 Minute of Music from The Pathless. But I'll just show you a little clip of the end of the beginning of this, and then I'll kind of skip around and show you little bits and pieces.
Is just at the beginning of 2020. I have a couple of cues left on The Pathless. I'm almost entirely done, but I thought it would be fun, while I have still a little bit of true blank page in front of me, to document the process of going from literally this to something that you can play back, on Spotify or in the game. I'm going to document little bits and pieces as we go, and hopefully capture something interesting in the process, or maybe get a glimpse of just spectacular failure in the making. We'll see one way or the other, but I hope it's interesting. I've been playing around with these motifs that have this kind of like... And so I was playing around with ideas, and I hit on one that I think feels right. It's based around this tension of the kind of... Something that was predetermined about this cue that's worth mentioning is that it's going to feature the bass clarinet as a soloist, which is going to be recorded by my dear friend Andrew Leonard. Each one of the kind of big bosses that you fight in the game has a solo instrument that I've kind of attached to it. So this little idea I've been playing around with. I've been working on this for a couple of hours, and one big revelation was realizing that it was feeling almost comedic, and I think the little tritone in the middle is the reason why. So I've modified it to this. There's a nastiness to that I think is working well. Here is how it's coming across so far. Just a bass clarinet solo. There's a little intro, just a little snarl.
So you're hearing my computer. Obviously, this is not real yet.
It's got these twists, and then with the dome, in the bass. I love me a good syncopation, but that might be a bit much with this. And I've done a lot to write and rewrite this already with the cameras off. If I get rid of some of the elements that are potentially crowding that up a bit, you can see that the string part is actually relatively simple.
So I'll skip ahead. You see I kind of go through all the steps, preparing for the orchestration, and my team that I work with for, they show how they proofread all the parts and everything, fly off to London, recording our percussion ensemble, and a big French horn ensemble of 10 horns, 5 on the left side of the room, 5 on the right, in a kind of antiphonal dialogue, which was quite fun. Back to LA with dear Andy.
It's possible for even that to be kind of like
making him suffer. Then mixing, once we have all the finished music, mixing with the wonderful Steve Kempster, and then talking with
Steve Green, whose job was to get it in the game per my instructions. This is the software we use for that.
I also received those mockups, as well as some basic information such
And
as
then,
a throw, a loop, a...
Here you can see the design of the piece.
And an outro. So from there, I take these pieces and I put them into Wise, and I keep them in a organized way so that they can be called the right times.
Skipping ahead, and here's the finished piece. There you go.
You know, so Austin, can you, on pause, can you put that on the screen where it's right there, at the end there where we're showing the MIDI tracks going across?
Yeah, the piano roll.
Yeah, the piano roll. So what you're actually looking at here is the music per line and instrument and notes. You know, you could have MIDI tracks, which at the beginning of the video you were seeing MIDI tracks with the different instruments, and the boxes contain the played-in MIDI that he plays in, the computer records that, and it sends the sound back out playing the sample that is the sound of the instrument that either is going to electronically be recorded or eventually recorded for real. And then the piano roll shows you all the notes that are being played by the computer as it goes by, or in this case you're hearing the recording as well, but it's showing you the music he put into the computer. And when he does that MIDI and he's hearing it back and playing it, what he was talking about when that's sent to transcription and stuff. So there's a person that has to take that and then convert it into readable music. Somebody then takes that, orchestrates it to assign it to all the instruments. Somebody takes that and creates all the separate parts that then go to the recording session. But in the electronic age that we live in now, it starts from this computer MIDI and the piano roll and things. But what I love about this video is that you show the old school, starting with that little piece of paper, jotting down a little motific idea, and as this video shows, it started as a series of, what was it, 7 or 8 notes, boom, boom, ba, ba, boom, ba, 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 and how long it took and how many different versions to get to what eventually became the germ of an idea that leads to that whole minute with all of the orchestration and everything done. And I think what this showcases so well, which is why I wanted you to show this, was how so many people look at video games as, especially because of the history of the past, as, you know, a young person's way of having a good time. It's entertainment. It's this throwaway thing, and not realizing the world of art that is being created within that goes way beyond the perception that a non-gamer may have of the video game world, and that this is real music being written. This is not some blips and bleeps and things that are creating a game that, as you were saying earlier, has its own place in history.
Those were pretty real music too. They just had their
it was
parameters.
organized sound that was organized into a way that underscored and had some great music, and it was music. But now where we've gotten to is there's music being written by composers like you for video games that stands against any symphonic music written of the past. And as we talked about, we have this respect for the Mozarts and the Haydns of the world and what they were able to create. But it was created in the same manner, but with different tools, but in the same concept of, was it Don Giovanni that he wrote the last aria the morning of the premiere? We look at it, this incredible piece of art, but it was written under the same constraints. Someone saying, I want a story like this, and people having to work around things. It was just for a different output artistically. It was for something that was going to be an opera or a concert piece or something. This is just music through a different medium, using a different technology to make it happen. But this process shows how it's no less different and no less quality. You know, obviously there are composers out there in video games and motion pictures, as well as concert music for hundreds of years, written that we may think is lesser. And then there's the ones that we think are great. That's the same as anything in the world. There's people that are great at it, and there's people that aren't great at it. But it's still art. It's still music coming through as art, just used in a different way. And I think what's incredible about you is that you take it to this next level with actually diving in with your interest in programming of the video games. How can we make the video game go to the next level as far as what's capable with the music I'm writing and heighten the experience? And I think this video really shows that well.
It's sort of my blessing and my curse because it makes game scoring a lot more arduous, but it's so much fun. There's a project I'm working on right now that is kind of putting all this to the test, which is a musical, where it's like, okay, what if we actually tell the story through the music now? And so it's literally one of those where I've spent almost 5 years already working on it, where the player is in control of what happens in the story, and the story is told through musical numbers. So I have to put the player in control directly of the music, and which means you have to, like we had something like 85 recording sessions for the cast because the sheer amount of branching, where you play through a song that might take 4 minutes to play through, but there might be 45 minutes worth of material at your fingertips that you don't know is there. So it's like just every year I'm just trying to find new ways to push this idea forward, because to me it feels like it's sort of our working in this field is the first time in a long time, in 100 years, give or take, that composers I think have been in the privileged position of working on the genuine frontier and vanguard of an art. That I think by the end of the 21st century, everything that I'm describing today will probably look like child's play. It'll all be AI and whatever. But the early days, we're actually like defining the precedents, and we're figuring it out. It really is, when you read the accounts of the Harold Arlens and the Alfred Newmans and the Franz Waxmans and the people that were kind of Max Steiner, the ones who were kind of deciding what film music would be. It wasn't even, they were the first ones to do it, and so they were the first ones going, well, we could try this, that could be interesting, and then that spawns a whole genre, and we're at, collectively as an industry, and I'm not taking personal credit for any of that sort of thing, but as an industry, we're at that like reckless teenager stage where we feel like we can do anything and we're immortal, and so everything is worth trying. And we haven't become like cynical, jaded adults yet collectively as an industry. And it feels really exciting because you're actually helping kind of define, knowing that, I'm one of many tiny little bricks in an overall kind of road that 100 years from now, people will look back and maybe everything that I've done will be like, oh, this is the quintessential catalog of ways not to do it. It's certainly possible. I don't make any claims about quality of why I work or anything like that. I just do my best. But there's no question that we're largely operating in no one's tried this. What if we did this? And oh, that was terrible. Let's try it this way this time, and that kind of thing. And I love scoring movies and television and that, but those ways are sort of set because 100 years ago, the Steiners and those folks of that era worked it out and found some good. And we're still being challenged. I mean, one of the great contributions of Hans Zimmer to the industry is he's always finding new ways to approach things even now. So it's not like it's a dead art by any stretch. But it's a sort of a single-dimensional art by comparison to the fact that, Tetris and Assassin's Creed are both video games. But they couldn't be more different from each other. There's not really a film equivalent to that. And that, to me, is what's really exciting. So anyway, I can go on about this stuff for eternity. We've locked the doors. So you're all here for the interminable future. No, I would rather cede the floor to our fabulous musicians who will kind of make all this less abstract, as they say, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. So let's stop that part of it,
So let me ask you, they have 3 pieces of music they're going to play, correct?
Yes.
And could you just tell us maybe a little bit about what they're going to hear?
Yeah, so hilariously, we didn't talk about Journey at all. They will play some music from Journey. Journey is just the quick capsule summary on Journey. Journey is the game that completely and totally altered the course of my career. I'll just let this show footage from the game while I talk. This was the little trailer we did when we recorded this score a long time ago. Journey came out exactly 10 years ago in March of 2012. The game was like a surprise hit. It was a very small little PlayStation game on PlayStation 3 made by a company called That Game Company. And it exploded beyond any of our anticipation. It was one of those where it's a very unique game. There's no dialogue. The story is entirely kind of subject to your interpretation. You just move through the world and basically just go from point A to point B. And by the end, people are sobbing and in tears and have this very kind of emotional experience with it. And I loved working on the game, spent 3 years working on this game, 2009 to 2012. And I remember thinking, wow, it's really special and unique and interesting. I hope people like it. I mean, I had the great honor of the BBC Proms and the Royal Philharmonic playing music from it at the Royal Albert Hall just a few months ago in their first ever video game show there. And so it's just like this game has sort of never stopped somehow mattering, and I don't really know what to chalk that up to, other than to say that TGC are brilliant and they made a very special game, and I feel very, very lucky to have been part of it. So we have a nice kind of contingent of music from that was arranged by a quartet back east that they performed around a bunch called the Videogame String Quartet. They made their own version, which we kind of took and added flute to, because as a special bonus, Amy Tatum, who played all the original flute solos on Journey, will be here to kind of reprise those original actual solos, which is very cool. And then the other two pieces both come from this Assassin's Creed game that I spoke at such length about, highlighting the kind of waltz of death nature. Oh, PS3 now, $249. Good to know. The general shtick with my, separate from everything else that I said, one of the ideas that I pitched to Ubisoft on Assassin's Creed was that the characters that you play as are very kind of, they're very kind of cocky and arrogant. And so I said it would be fun if every time you get into a fight, the combat music is actually kind of like a waltz, or it has an otherwise dancing quality, creating the subtext that they don't take their opponents very seriously. It's like when you watch a cat play with a mouse. The mouse is fighting for its life, and it may as well be this like grand, epic, horrible boss fight from the mouse's perspective. But from the cat's perspective, this is a joke. This wouldn't even have score. This is not a moment worth capturing. It's like idle entertainment. So I said, what if we try to capture that kind of perspective with these characters? So there's a certain sarcastic dancing quality as a way to try to do something different. Again, I thought I would be fired. Instead, they said, how many waltzes can you write? And I had to write so many waltzes. And
then you wondered, why did I suggest this?
Oh yeah, no, it's 100%. Watch what you say. So anyway, I will let I don't know if this will take care of itself, but I will happily yield to our fabulous Orchid Quartet and Amy Tatum.
Start with music from Assassin's Creed Syndicate.
One more for the big one. Thank you.
Assassin's Creed Syndicate.
I think that's it from us. Thank you all.
Thank you, ladies. That was a lot. That was totally awesome. You blew us away. I think that's the first time music has been played in this room, if McKenna and I are right. So I want to thank you for being here and invite all of you. Did you have a good time? Well, don't keep it a secret then. Well, Andrew's going out to set up the reception, and it'll be by the gift shop. And Austin will be joining us. And as many of you can join us, we'd love to see you. So thank you for being here, and have a good afternoon. We'll see you over at the reception.